Good morning. My name is Malcolm Young. I'm the Dean of Grace Cathedral. Welcome to the Form Fall season. Each year, we choose a theme to help provide focus and create new ways to grow as a community. Our 2023 theme is the Year of Poetry. During this year, we are exploring the walls that separate us from each other and the words that help connect us. My guest today is Lee Herrick. Lee is California's 10th Poet Laureate and the first Asian American to serve in that role. A former Fresno Poet Laureate, his work explores the diversity and vitality of the California experience. Today, we're going to be talking about poetry as a bridge to social justice and the enduring power of poetry. Lee, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Honored to be here.
Yeah, it's such a gift that you could make it. I know that you're traveling so far, and we're so glad that you could be here in San Francisco.
Oh, it's great to be here.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me. It's nice.
How does one write a poem? How do you write a poem?
You know, for me, one of the first impulses comes through sound. You know, I've always experienced the world first through some kind of sonic or auditory experience. I mean, it can be the sound of a child's voice or wind through the trees or even some kind of memory. And so that's often the first way the poems come to me. And then there's just a lot of work and process with it, drafting, revising, finding the words to say it in some way that is hopefully unique. But each one is a little bit different, maybe like a painting or a song. But sound is often my first entry point.
Yeah, you know, even reading them, I felt badly not to be reading them out loud, you know, because they did seem like they were made for sound. And there's a kind of musicality that's such a part of your work, as I experience it as a reader. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about music and the connection between music that you love and music as a connection to your work.
Yeah, you know, I had this thought recently that sound and music came into my life before I came to the United States. So I was adopted from Korea. I was born in South Korea, and I don't have any conscious memories of it, but I think that I had to have heard music. I had to have heard maybe someone singing or humming. And so I don't know if that's why the lyric is so important to me in poetry, but it is. And so I'm often thinking in terms of rhythm or pacing or even the sounds of different words, how they sit next to each other. Also, I can say I used to really want to be a musician, you know. And so anytime I'm around music, it's a good place to be, and poetry can be another form of music, I think.
What kind of poetry or music do you like? What kind of music draws you? And what instrument would you have played as a musician?
Wondering if I should embarrass myself here. I like to play guitar.
Yeah.
I don't play it well, but as I say to my friends, you don't have to be great at everything to love doing it, you know? So it's great fun for me just to pull out my guitar and play a little bit. Early on, you know, I listened to a lot of classic rock. I liked Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin and groups like that, Led Zeppelin. In high school, some of the anger that I was experiencing and confusion that I realize now was related to my adoption became a great way to connect with rap music and punk. That energy, that sort of raw vitality in that music really spoke to me. But now, you know, I like a good folk song. Anything with strings, I love.
I play the ukulele, and every summer we go to the beach in Hawaii. The whole family will get together and sing and play the ukulele. So I totally get what you're talking about. And it's like, I'm not going to win any awards for ukulele playing.
And do you sing while you're playing?
We all do that, yeah, exactly.
Excellent.
So the whole family is kind of like a family activity.
Yeah.
But maybe you could talk a little bit about just like that high school kind of coming to consciousness of just kind of like what your identity is, and what it was like to be adopted and be growing up in your setting.
Yeah, so I was adopted and came to the United States in 1971, and the 70s were a time when it was more common to hear things like we're all the same, and we don't see color, and things like that. And so those were well-intentioned, of course, but they also served, in my case, as a form of erasure, and just kept Korea at a distance for me. And so it took some time, and I think each of us arrives at some knowing in different ways, some more difficult journeys than others, some more traumatic at times. But I do think of adoption as that. I like to say I was born on the other side of planet Earth.
Yes, I hear that in your poetry.
Yeah, and that's going to have an impact on someone. So my family was very loving. I'm still close with them. My father's in his 80s. My mother's in her early 80s. And it was a very loving home, but being the only person of color had its challenges for sure. And so going through periods of, like I mentioned, anger and doubt and confusion, for me, those were the high school years. On the one hand, I had plenty of friends, and I was on the soccer team and trying to get decent grades, but inside, I was really experiencing a lot of challenges with identity, racism, and things like that. So, as I like to say now, thank goodness for poetry. Yeah. Thank goodness for the arts, music, painting, whatever it might be. But in my case, it helped get me through. And I think that poetry can serve many people in those ways. I mean, it's often the form or the genre someone might bring into a wedding ceremony or a memorial service. And so in addition to those monumental, memorable moments in our lives, it's also just a great opportunity for grace any day of the week. I think poetry ought to be a regular part of our lives.
Yeah, the poet Atsuro Riley is a member of our congregation, and he has been so inspiring for me. And basically what happened is that we had a cathedral retreat that was focused on poetry, and the first thing he said to us when he gathered us all together, he said, poetry's on the job. It's here to help you. Mm-hmm. And it's been enormously transformative for me this last year to be like looking for some other voices to help express the deepest feelings that we have, the most profound occasions. Mm-hmm. And so I think I've used like 200 poems in different public settings over those last
excellent.
Year. Yeah.
That's excellent. I mean, there are some really important commonalities with the two fields.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I think that's interesting. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that, because you're also the editor of The World I Leave You, Asian American Poets on Faith and Spirit. And I just think this is a wonderful volume, and I wonder how it came into being, and just how you see that connection too between kind of the religious calling and the poetic calling.
Yeah. Well, before I speak about the anthology, I could just say briefly that I wasn't raised in a church per se, but became very close for times in my life where it was very difficult, and someone was there for me. Yeah. And so this anthology came to be when a good friend of mine at the time, Leah Silvius, she's a Korean adoptee also. A brilliant poet, and she's also, I believe, just finished her experience at Yale Divinity School.
Oh, great.
She was studying there. So I had met Leah some years ago. I even saw her in Korea when we were both there in 2008. And then we realized we both took DNA tests, not knowing each of us were, we were doing that. And we realized that we're related. And it was just stunning, you know. It felt like one of those things that I don't want to say meant to be, but the synchronicity is just synergy. So, and she's a poet, and she said that she was working on an idea for an anthology about just this, Asian American poets on faith and spirit. And she asked me to be her co-editor. And I took a month or two to think about it, partly because of my schedule, but more importantly, if I had the license or if I had
You're authorized, exactly. I can imagine that,
Yeah. And so it's really her vision. She shaped the majority of the book. The book also explores faith from a number of different faiths, but also questions. Thematic threads run through the book. But the idea that we both share is that it's an important part of our lives, of any society, and we're very proud of the book. It's a very diverse book with Asian American poets from all walks of life writing about their views and experiences with faith.
Yeah, and all sorts of different Asian Americans, too. Mm-hmm. I love that about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about kind of the poets that have influenced you, and even just how your thoughts on them have changed over time too. Because I can imagine, poets you loved when you're 16, and then when you're 26 may have a different resonance for you.
Yeah, that's a good question. My first experience, I think, is like many, and that's through the schools.
Yeah.
And so in high school, I had a wonderful teacher, the late Nancy Barr in Modesto, California, and she was about, 6 feet tall, and she wore heels and very regal. Yeah. And she gave us an assignment to recite a monologue from a Shakespeare play. And it terrified me because at the time, speaking in public terrified me. But there was also something really powerful in that writing. I didn't understand it entirely, but the rhythm of the language, and as I came to understand Shakespeare's plays and sonnets, he wrote mostly sonnets, was an early formative experience for me. And how that's changed, it's just deepened, really. The admiration for that lyricism has just grown, quite frankly. I read Walt Whitman.
Yeah.
I know you're an expert with Henry David Thoreau, who I don't think was a poet per se, but that period of American literature, mid-19th century, was very formative for me. Emerson and people like that. In college is when, I think for many, and it was my situation, where the world just opened up. Right, so we go from sort of a state-mandated curriculum to college professors who have license to assign what they would like, for the most part. And so I was reading people like June Jordan from Berkeley, and some of the first Asian American poets I read were in high school. I was exposed to Latin American poets. The Mexican poet Octavio Paz was very formative for me. And so as that literature widened, my view of the world and my view of myself and my place in the world started to become larger. And so it was around that time I also read some of my first adopted Korean authors, which was very transformative.
That must have been amazing.
It was really powerful to experience that. I can still remember, it was one of my college professors who saw some advertisement in a literary magazine, and she just handed me and said, Lee, I don't know if you'd want to read this. And I still like that she didn't put that pressure on me. And I think it took me a few weeks to read it, but my heart was beating the whole time, because when something speaks to you like that for the first time, it's transformative. So, it is an ongoing relationship with literature. I continue to experience those things. We read them differently, but it's such a powerful genre that's always there for one person or a society or whatever it might be, but it's been a big part of my life.
Just reading your poems, that there's a way in which you're coming to consciousness about your connection to Korea. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that, and just how it's influenced the art and influenced just how you understand yourself too.
Yeah. I think it was a way of coming home, or a way of realizing more of myself. I cannot speak for all adoptees, needless to say, but most estimates say there are around 200,000 of us around the world, which is not a lot. And so the literature for me was a way of coming home, but also very expansive. I grew up, I'm pretty versed in American culture, pop culture, media culture. I like to think of myself as an amateur historian. My master's thesis was in presidential rhetoric, so I studied Aristotle and the crisis speeches of John F. Kennedy. So I've got this sort of makeup. And at different times, for different reasons, adoptees start to ask and wonder. It's inevitable, I think. A person might go into her 50s and 60s, and maybe throughout their whole life, trying to mute that. But in my case, it started to arise in my mid to late 20s. Race consciousness became inevitable for me.
Yeah.
And so, if you don't see yourself your whole life reflected in the media is one thing, in your community is another, but adoptees often experience it in the family,
yeah, exactly.
in the home,
yeah.
where ostensibly one should theoretically feel most him or her or themselves. So for the adoptee, in my case, it was there as well. So where would I go? I started to look up films. I tried to listen to the language. I tried to listen to some of the music. But for me, what resonated most was the stories, the literature, the poems. I remember in college, one of my favorite professors, probably about 6'4", really large white gentleman from Nebraska, played football. But he was a brilliant scholar with Japanese literature and adolescent literature. And in the library one day, he asked me if I'd ever read a Korean story or a Korean novel. And I remember thinking in that moment, I wanted to impress him. And I was racking my brain, and I wanted to just say one Korean writer. And I just sort of sheepishly said, no, I don't think so, but maybe, that kind of answer.
Yeah.
And he said, well, if you ever want to talk about it, just let me know. I can recommend some things. So those kinds of acts, they might not have been anything to that professor, but it was a game changer for me.
Yeah.
So I read my first Korean novella at that time, and started to feel more comfortable with who I was. And with Korean adoptee culture, that's its own vibrant, beautiful culture in its own right. I was reminded this morning there's a great organization here in the Bay Area called AKASF. And there's a group of women, primarily, I think, who are doing this study at someone's home. And that literature is growing too. Just last year, there was the first online adoption literature festival. And so adoptees are finding each other and finding ways to connect and talk about their experiences.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting to hear. So my brother is married to a Korean woman, and there's a way in which he's the only white person in the household. But there is a way in which the children do have two parents to kind of guide them in their search. And it is interesting to think of you just being kind of on your own to kind of learn these things. I wonder if you have any advice for parents who have adopted someone, like advice to help them to kind of be better parents.
Well, I was just speaking at a conference for a great organization. It's based here in the Bay Area, but they also have a conference that they do and a retreat in Maryland. But it's called PACT, P-A-C-T, and they're based here in the Bay Area. And they, at their retreat, they asked me this very question, and there was a room full of adoptive parents. I guess it would depend on where the adoptee is coming from. Domestic adoption is somewhat different than transnational adoption. Transracial adoption adds another layer to it. But if we're talking about adoptees of color, let's say, in a white family, to the parents, I would say that racism is very real and very impactful. And just because they don't see it doesn't mean it's not impacting their children regularly. You often see parents wanting to boast about the piano performance, which is a proud moment. And not to say that every difficulty in a person's life is related to that, but those blind spots, in my experience, can be problematic. I would encourage them also to listen to them and believe them when they talk about their emotions related to race, or gender, or adoption. It's not all as it's depicted in the media. Aren't you so lucky? And other things like that might make a mainstream audience feel good. And we all want to feel good. But we're also all human enough to know that the experience, wherever we're coming from, is complex. And for the adoptee, it's rooted in that initial, again, I would consider it traumatic experience. So I think for the adoptee, having that kind of place or space to be heard and seen, whether she is 5 or whether she's 20. And certainly the last thing I would say, and I could go on this one, but the last thing I'll say is that just to reduce what we would call the savior syndrome. But and there's great literature out there, great organizations, support systems.
I just read that article in the New York Times about Korean adoption, so that's the reason why I knew there were 200,000 adoptees in the world. But I can imagine it has such a different valence when you're the one experiencing it, and when you're, part of your calling is to be able to speak eloquently about it, so that you can connect with people on a human level as a poet.
And that's been a great part of it. I think. When my first book came out in 2007, I had only met maybe 1 or 2 adoptees. And I remember thinking, I wonder if any adoptees will read this. And at the time, I didn't know any Korean adoptees who had published a book of poems. There's Jane Jong Trenka, who had published a memoir, but the only Korean person I knew was the great Korean-American poet Ishil Park. But once the book came out, you're talking about the adoptees and where we are, it was a blessing and a gift to meet so many adoptees. I would be in different cities, and people would come to the events, and we'd talk. They'd tell me their experience. I remember one back east, I was signing books, and there was an Asian woman standing with white or Caucasian male, and she was kind of a little hesitant to come up to the table, and I wondered, maybe she's an adoptee. And the signing was over, and finally she made her way up, and she told me that she drove for an hour and a half, had never met another adoptee, and she was in her 50s, and we ended up talking for about an hour after the reading.
Yeah.
So those kinds of things I'm very grateful for.
Yeah, that gives me chicken skin, as the Hawaiians say. You know, I mean, because you're right. I mean, it's a kind of ministry to draw together these seeds that have been scattered so widely, and to be able to draw them together through your work, and to welcome people back home to themselves.
Well, I take that as a great compliment and honor. I'm not worthy of the word ministry, but if you see it in that light, I'm going to believe you.
For sure.
And but it is, and as much as it might be something positive for them, I feel equally rewarded.
Yeah.
It's just really a blessing.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
You know, tell us a little bit about being the Fresno Poet Laureate, and then about becoming the California Poet Laureate, because I can imagine that too. I mean, it opens doors of connection between you and so many people, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about that journey. When you were 17 years old, did you know you were going to be the California Poet Laureate?
No. When I was 17, I thought I was just telling somebody the other day, I just wanted to be rich.
Well, you're rich in ideas.
This is true, I hope. But after I realized I wasn't going to be some real estate tycoon and literature was my calling, so I was Fresno Poet Laureate in 2015 to 2017. And that was an incredible experience. I think, you know, the laureateship generally is a connection between poetry and the civic fabric of any town or state. And so it's an official position. So in Fresno, I was appointed by the mayor, and that's after a nominations process and a selections process. I spoke everywhere from high schools to state prisons to one that comes to mind now. There was a family whose 8-year-old son was killed tragically in a car accident. And the family decided to donate his organs to a wonderful organization called Donor Network West. And in that process, he was able to save 4 people's lives. Wow. And the family asked me to write a poem, and Donor Network West asked me to write a poem for the boy, because he was being honored at the Rose Bowl parade. So things like that, many laureates, I think, do this kind of work. I mean, one of the great joys of this California appointment has been seeing so many communities around the state and the poets laureate in those communities who are doing incredible work. When I was appointed California Poet Laureate, it was late November 2022. Wow. And that was after about a 7 or 8 month process, a lot of waiting. You know, the government and the governor's office has a very full plate, needless to say. And I didn't think much of it. You know, there are many great poets doing incredible work throughout the state. But, you know, I got the call that I was being advanced and interviewed with some people from the governor's office. And it's been an incredible, expansive joy, you know. It's been everything from events with the First Partner. She's got a great book club.
She was a forum guest, too.
She was.
Yeah.
It's fantastic.
So, yeah, book club, that's great. So you could be part of that conversation, too.
Yes. So as you know, she's a real advocate for the arts and reading, and she's a documentarian. So we did an event in San Francisco, and I've been most parts of the state so far. I'm only in my first year. It's a 2-year term. But, you know...
How has it helped you see California in a different way? Because, I mean, as someone who grew up from the Central Valley, people don't understand what it's like there. In San Diego or Orange County or LA County or Santa Barbara or Central Coast, I mean, each region really has a different feel to it. And what has been surprising to you as you began to learn about other regions that you weren't familiar with before and become the spokesperson for your own region?
Oh, so how am I seeing other regions?
Yeah.
Well, you know, I see it through a poetry lens, for one, because that's often why I'm there. But, you know, just how much it means to people. For example, I was in Lake County, Colusa,
Oh
and
yeah, completely.
had never been there.
Right.
But they've got a robust Friends of the Library program and a fantastic Poet Laureate. And that's been my experience. I was just in Modesto last night, and a wonderful poetry center celebrating its 10th year. They just appointed their first youth poet laureate. So a lot of young people I'm seeing getting involved with poetry. And of course, the cities are known for it. I mean, when I was in high school and college, I would drive up from the Central Valley and come to the City Lights bookstore, Green Apple, and just spend hours in those bookstores. Fresno has got an incredible poetry community. People often point to our two former U.S. Poets Laureate, Phil Levine and Juan Felipe Herrera. I want to borrow an idea from my wife, Lisa, who's also a brilliant essayist. She's also a food person. And we often think about some differences between Fresno and some maybe more cosmopolitan cities in terms of food, where some cities will have the James Beard Award-winning restaurants, but they're using some of the food from the valley.
Yeah.
And Fresno might not have the glitz, but for me, the beauty is in the people. It's in the farm workers. It's in the people doing the hard work. And I think that produces some of the poetry. A lot
It
of
does in
people
your
will ask
case.
that.
I mean, I just even love just thinking about that, like overhearing an Armenian neighbor's conversation, or just the mariachi bands, and just there's so much there that just it feels like Fresno to me. When you're right. I mean, your poem on California, My California. It's such a. There it is. It's such an economy of words, and yet you have that feeling. I don't know if you'd want to read that, or if you want to read something from Scar and Flower, but it might be good to give our viewers a chance to know what it sounds like.
Sure.
I don't know if that's what you want.
I'd be happy to.
Okay,
Thank
great.
you for asking. I wrote this poem thinking about not only different things I'd seen, but also things I'd hoped for.
Yeah.
My California. Here, an olive votive keeps the sunset lit. The Korean 20-somethings talk about hyphens, graduate school, and good pot. And a group of 4 at a window table in Carpinteria discuss the quality of wines in Napa Valley versus Lodi. Here, in my California, the streets remember the Chicano poet whose songs still bank off Fresno's beer-soaked gutters and almond trees in partial blossom. Here, in my California, we fish out long noodles from the pho with such accuracy you'd know we'd done this before. In Fresno, the bullets tire of themselves and begin to pray 5 times a day. In Fresno, we hope for less of the police state and more of a state of grace. In my California, you can watch the sun go down like in your California, on the ledge of the pregnant 22nd century, the one with a bounty of peaches and grapes, red onions, and the good salsa, wine and japchae. Here in my California, paperbacks are free. Farmers' markets are 24 hours a day and always packed. The trees and water have no nails in them. The priests eat well. The homeless eat well. Here in my California, everywhere is Chinatown. Everywhere is K-Town. Everywhere is Armenia Town. Everywhere, a little Italy. Less Confederacy. No internment in the valley. Better history texts for the juniors. In my California, free sounds and free touch. Free questions, free answers. Free songs, from parents and poets, those hopeful bodies of light.
Thank you so much. I think there's no better way for understanding what is. Yeah. You know, in Scar and Flower, I mean, one of the things that struck me was just how often the word gun appears in the poems. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about your frame of mind in writing the Scar and Flower.
Yeah. So Scar and Flower, my latest book, was written over a 4-year span, about 2014 to 2018. And that seemed to me to be a time where the American media was publicizing more frequently what is an American, unfortunately, norm, which is gun violence. And I was seeing it more. And in 2016, you know, there were people like Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, all killed. And I just couldn't shake those deaths. You know, I would hear the families pleading to someone for mercy or help or justice. And going back to what I mentioned earlier about my experience with sound, I just couldn't get those voices clear, you know, and I couldn't really make sense of them. So I was writing a lot about those things. And guns, there's a poem in the book for Newtown, Connecticut,
right.
where 20 first graders, 20 6- and 7-year-olds were killed, and some teachers. There's a poem in the book after the Pulse nightclub shooting in Orlando, an LGBTQ dance club, where 49 people were killed. And so, yeah, I was just writing what I needed to write maybe at that time. And that's the first part of the book.
Yeah.
Those kinds of things. There's also a poem in the book for a Korean adoptee who was deported.
Yeah, you could talk about
that.
Yeah.
His name was Philip Clay, and he was adopted to the United States. And through a horrible loophole in one of our immigration laws, adoptees my age and Philip Clay's age weren't automatically U.S. citizens. Mm-hmm. So our parents at that time had to go through a naturalization process. Well, his never did, and then he was deported back to South Korea and ended up committing suicide in 2017. And so there's a poem in the book for him, and I was asked by his close friends to write a poem for his memorial service. Mm-hmm. I could mention that there is a bill going through Congress that we hope is gaining traction. I believe it passed one branch, but that would close that loophole and grant all adoptees citizenship. Yeah. I mean, Philip was raised here, drove here, worked here, never knew anything else. But yeah, so the second half of the book then, Flower, my thinking was just how we navigate that, how people or how I was finding solace or making it through some of those difficult times. So it was a difficult book to write, but rewarding in the end.
Yeah, it's very powerful, and I can imagine it would just be, you know, some of those poems are very difficult ones.
Thank you.
You know.
Thank you.
Could you talk a little bit about just like kind of structure and form? Like, how did you decide? Like, what kind of form and structure do you think of when you're writing, and then what do you do when you teach other people's poetic works?
Well, usually I enter a poem with free verse. Yeah. I'm usually thinking of some kind of lyric impulse. So one example of a poetry craft term or strategy that I like is anaphora, which is really just moving a word or phrase throughout a poem for some rhythmic effect. So My California does that, for example. Yeah. There are places where I'll say my California or in my California or in your California. So that's one thing. I'm also very interested in syllabics and beat or meter. Yeah. So, and this goes back to Shakespeare or Elizabeth Barrett Browning, where in one of their sonnets, it sounds like this if you just read it.
Yeah.
How do I love thee? Let me count the ways.
Right.
But
The
that's...
art of losing isn't hard to master.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. And so I'm just realizing we could geek out about literature right now. But those are I ams, right? So, how do I love thee? Let me count the ways. So depending on where one is with their writing, first I just encourage them to let the ink spill, to try to be free and not censor oneself. And then some of the craft things can come later. Where I am now when I'm writing, there are times when I enter a poem specifically trying to write sonnets.
Yeah.
I'm writing a lot of form right now. So I specifically love the Petrarchan sonnet, and I love villanelles. That's a 19-line French form. And with student poets, again, depending on where they are, seeing where they are and nudging them, whether it's going there, as we call it, sort of pushing the emotional risk or content, or whether it's a craft and form issue where we can work on those parts of a poem. But it's good, fun work.
Yeah, I can imagine too that you've probably seen students change over time. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, like what were students like when you were first entering and how things are now?
Oh, just in general, I try not to bemoan.
Yeah, I try so hard not to be that person.
Too much.
Exactly, I don't want to be that person.
Yeah.
It's just like, seems like I'm cut off. All the young people today don't even know what it's such and such.
Yeah.
I don't want to be that person.
Yeah, and here's how I can, I think, legitimately justify that.
Yeah, and the thing is that there is a way in which knowing something about what it was like before can be very helpful.
Yes.
Yeah.
To that end, when the typewriter was invented, its predecessors who were in education, who were used to seeing students writing by hand, bemoaned this technology. And then if you remember when typewriters had the eraser ribbon.
Right.
And then the word processor had a disk on which you could save your work. These kinds of things are always met with some understandable skepticism. To be fair, I have seen some changes because I think, it's one thing going from a typewriter to an eraser ribbon, but with the advent of a cell phone and texting and communications, I have seen some changes there. But it's not with writing as much as one might think. I think writing skills and writing challenges will always be there.
Yeah.
This might be getting into the weeds a little bit, but one punctuation issue I've seen, because it's not as common in texting, is the comma and the apostrophe and capitalization.
Right.
More students these days are used to not doing that. But I think they're as smart as ever. If there's something that I've seen with students changing and technology, and that is maybe, I don't want to question the work ethic, but I think they see work differently.
Yeah.
I wonder if they have the same sense of patience. But again, it's a new norm, for lack of a better term. And I think there are ways to inspire and learn and grow wherever we are. But yeah.
Yeah, it's funny because there are definitely those technology things where it was just a lot harder for us to, like, we wanted to know in 1975, like, what the population of Indonesia was.
Right.
We'd have to go to the library and look up in an encyclopedia.
Yeah.
And there is a way in which just being able to get anything instantaneous. I even want older people to have, like, well, do you think the population in Indonesia is closer to 20 million or 30? And when they have this conversation, everybody, like, a young person would never have that conversation. They'd just look it up.
Yeah.
So there is a way in which that's such a different.
That's very different. And that reminds me of another example I was thinking of the other day, where one used to be driving on the freeway, and if you were lost because you couldn't read the map or for whatever reason, you remember we could stop at a gas station and ask someone, and the attendant would help you because it was expected. I do think that's changed over the years. You know, I started teaching in 1995, and just with human connection, I think it's different. Whether it's through dating or just the old-fashioned road trip with some friends or just a long conversation for its own sake.
Yeah.
The joy of that communion. But
yeah, so people are kind of, you're right, being with other people kind of pull out their phone and it kind of interrupts things.
Yeah, yeah. So maybe the sense of being present has shifted slightly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, I also just, even when you were talking about, I mean, I just felt like there were ways in which 1970s society was just so much more overtly racist, like television shows and radio. And and I think there is a way in which younger people are kind of more connected in different ways.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, boy, the 70s, some of those shows, you know.
Yeah.
And when you're young, or when I was young, I sensed something was off.
Right.
But now when I watch it as an adult,
Yeah.
it's just
it's hard to believe it.
frightening.
It is. Yeah.
And yes. And now, you know, films slowly are getting better. But I do think television and some streaming services are really where some change is occurring.
Yeah.
As a Korean American, it's surreal to hear people who aren't Asian American talk about shows with entirely Asian casts with such a love and interest. That's sort of wonderful, but sort of different, because that was not my experience as a kid.
Completely. And I guess that goes to just like the world of having 3 television stations and having that. It's just a much broader world in terms of what we have access to.
Oh, 3 televisions, and also a television in your car, or you can watch it at lunch.
Exactly, completely.
This reminds me, just a few months ago, I did a talk with an organization I'd never heard of, but just a wonderful group. It's called the Coalition to End Social Isolation and Loneliness.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, based in D.C., and they see what harmful repercussions there are with social isolation. Yeah. And that can be from any number of experiences: aging, ability to move, mental health, you name it.
Yeah.
And so I think television has its place, but I really think there's no replacing just a good conversation.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
And one of the traditions I didn't tell you about that we have is we take questions from the audience. So people write down questions. So Rebecca Nessel is going to be collecting questions.
Okay.
Yeah. You know, the poem Elegy in here is that poem that you referred to earlier. I wonder if you might read it for us, or
I'd be happy to.
Yeah, that'd be great. I didn't mark it.
Yeah, I can.
So I think it's page 47.
Okay, thank you.
But I want to hear your voices, because I've been hearing your voice in my imagination. Now having you actually hear is.
Okay. Well, I will say now, if I don't get a chance to say it at the end, what an honor it's been. But also, I appreciate your reading of the poems.
They've meant a lot to me. Thank you.
Thank you. So Elegy is the poem that I wrote for Philip Clay. It's got a short description before the poem. For Philip Clay, 1974 to 2017, born in South Korea, adopted to the United States, deported back to Korea, committed suicide in 2017. Elegy. In my dream, when you fell through the sky from 14 stories high, all burning paper, your body broke into 100 flowers and floated into the clouds. The moon and stars still. Your fire now ash, your spirit free, wild, and true, in a deep calm where country is a black night, a blank question of insufficient starlight, where no child, man or woman, no idea as beautiful as you is ever deported, is ever only the harsh light of your deepest wound. I wish I could have eaten your fire and howled with you. Eclipse, fracture, angelic cloud song. May the wild and broken stars remember you. May you be at peace in a quiet part of the sky.
Yeah, so beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I wonder what it's like for you to read your poetry in public. I mean, it's so powerful to read it off the page, but for me to hear it, it has a totally deeper resonance for me. But I wonder, are there, what you're getting from, I was thinking about your master's thesis on political rhetoric, and it just, what it is that the audience or the listeners give to you. And are there poems that you just don't want to read that you've written in public?
Well, to the last part first, no, I'm comfortable with reading at least any poem that's published or in a book. I'm comfortable reading. The experience reading in public, in some ways it changes depending on the venue and the audience and maybe the purpose for the event. But those things I try not to ever let change how I'm reading. A friend of mine has a book coming out soon, and she was asking me about that, different audiences and different readings. And all I told her was my own take, and she can do what she wants. But I said, I try not to change who I am based on where I'm reading.
Yeah.
To me, that would be sort of a never-ending chase, So if I'm talking about race, for example, I want to be true to that.
Yeah.
If I'm talking about adoption, I want to be true to that. As far as reading, I love the act of reading. It's hard because you can never tell. Sometimes people will come up to you or they'll write to me afterwards, and I can tell sometimes when I'm reading, especially. Of course, I know this is being filmed, but if I'm reading and looking specifically at the audience, I like to try to, not just make eye contact superficially, but even in a moment, be there with the audience members.
Yeah.
Because I used to just read, I'd leave the city, I'd be exhausted, and then at some point I realized I want to get something out of this too. You know? And so those are some things that I think of when I'm reading.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I do find that, I know that when I'm boring people, and so it's like a dance. It's like we're dancing together, and people through their facial expressions are telling me what I need to know in order to. So I do appreciate that part of it.
Have you spoken or written about that? You could probably, of course, give a master class on this. I'll be watching your.
I think about it all the time. Yeah. Because in a way, writing a sermon is imagining how people are going to respond to something. Because you can say something so horrible that it's impossible to, and I don't mean that like boring. I mean just like brutal, unkind, horrifying, things that really hurt people. And so, but by the same token, you just don't want everything to be completely flat either. And so, it's the art of just imagining how something's going to feel to someone.
Yeah, I mean, and where you are and at the level you're doing it. But boy, if there's anything where oratory skills and power and emotion and meaning come to play, it's with your work.
It's funny, I studied rhetoric at UC Berkeley, and I learned, it was what I was really drawn to, so there's the thing I felt like I had to do for my parents, and their thing that I wanted to do and that rhetoric was, and I just had no idea that this thing I was so drawn to would be by far the most important thing, and the other things I was doing for my family's sake were just not.
Yeah, I could see the connections though.
Yeah.
Rhetorical studies and language. Yeah,
completely.
Yeah.
All right. Here's a great question. So this is from our audience. How can social media be a positive force?
How can social media be a positive force? Well, I think like with many things, the more one has an understanding of the overall context, then they can best answer that question, how it can be positive. In my case, and I think most people's case, they would recognize that social media has the great potential for harm.
Yeah.
Therefore, limiting those factors, I think, will provide the best opportunity for positive results. So, for example, and I don't know if this is good, but it works for me, is I don't feel like I have to be on every one.
Yeah.
And so even as California Poet Laureate, I know that Instagram seems to be one of the most widely used now, but I don't have one.
Yeah.
And that's not because I'm trying to make some statement or I feel I'm better or I can't do this. It's just my time and energies. And I think, I would argue, all of our time and energies are valuable.
Yeah.
And then it becomes, where do I want to spend that value? Whether it's with family, whether it's going on a hike, whether it's watching some TV or some social media. So I limit it,
Yeah.
not just in the platforms, but also on the one platform I'm on, I'm not on it that much.
Yeah.
I might post something about an event. I might click like on a relative's photo, but I'm certainly not getting into the negativity and the mudslinging. That's counterproductive to most positive things that I can think of.
Yeah. Yeah, on the one hand, I want to be a positive contributor, and you're right, I'm just not exposed to very much of that.
Yeah. And not, even if we're not really active on it, I think just not participating in it can be some kind of statement, but...
Does the state of California give you any direction in terms of like communications or anything like that to help you as a poet laureate?
So let's see. Yes. I mean, the governor's office, it was quite an interview process.
Yeah.
And, it's a public appointment. So I had to go through Senate confirmation, which was a pretty pleasant process, honestly. But I'm aware of the position. I don't typically get involved with really heated political debates.
Yeah.
I have my views, but I don't voice them on social media. And yeah, there are areas where I just don't want to get involved, and others where I will, if there's just something, for example, a mass shooting, I will express my thoughts on that. But social media, I think we all should be mindful of how we spend our time
so
there.
True. So here's, I'm going to put my glasses on. My eyesight's failing. I want to make sure I get it right. Please talk a little about the spiritual significance of food in your work. I like that.
That's a good question.
Yeah.
For me, it goes back to the people making it and growing it. My mother-in-law, my wife is Hmong, and Hmong American, and she's written beautiful essays. I think one was a notable they call it the Best American Food Writing.
Oh, great. Yeah.
And she's written things where she's talking about her mother and the Hmong word for this herb, or how recipes aren't by the third of a cup, but other ways to measure.
That's
and so when I think of spirit and food, I think of the people, their histories, what they've survived, what it takes to grow that food. That's a process.
Yeah.
The many months of making kimchi or whatever it might be. So I think then when you're eating it or enjoying it, and this is this is very much not a food person answer. I'm sure there are words that are better here. But sometimes I really am eating something that feels spiritual, like a taco. There's a line, I wrote a line where a taco so full of music, I almost wept. Have you had meals where you can almost feel?
Yes. That's
So,
funny that other people notice that too. There's so many more questions, but we're running out.
Okay.
In red parts of California, do you interact with people who don't like your social justice warriors? How do you find common ground or approach conversations with people of starkly different worldviews? Can poetry be a bridge?
It's a great question. I haven't encountered a lot of it in person. At the readings, people are coming to the readings, and I think they want to be there. Online, there was one comment. I remember I looked at the governor's Twitter announcing the California Poet Laureate, and we were at a function, and I was reading a poem, and I think one person just commented one word. The person said, "cringy."
Oh, that's
And
horrible.
it kind of made me chuckle.
Yeah. Sorry.
I don't know that everyone has to love poetry. This might be antithetical to the position, but I'm not one to force anything on anyone.
Yeah, completely.
It might be music. It might be painting. But I don't know any person, regardless of her political affiliation, who doesn't have a group they love, or a painting they like, or a film that they watch over and over. So I think that downgrading the fear and the tension and the readiness is one strategy that I just subconsciously use when I'm in those situations. I'm comfortable engaging if I need to, but usually and almost invariably that's not the case.
Yeah, and by the same token, I mean, as somebody who reads your poetry, I do feel like there is a social justice element all the way through, and there is a deep respect for the humanity of every person, and a loving kind of regard for what different groups of people have to bring. And that's why I love, Our California, in a way, is what we're talking about.
Very much. I mean, just briefly to add on, I used to not know how to take that term, this activist, social justice. But if that means decency, if that means caring that innocent people don't get killed, I am that.
Yeah,
I am that person. And so, I'm comfortable with that.
There's no such thing as human dignity in the abstract, and that's what I love about your poetry. It is very particular and specific.
Thank you.
Yeah, when someone compares you to Walt Whitman, I love Walt Whitman too.
Thank you.
I'm so sorry that we have so many questions, and we have
I'll try to
not
answer
enough
them.
time, though, because I've got to go upstairs and be
Okay,
part of the church
okay.
service. But I have our little closing statement. Let me read that. Okay. All right. Please join me next Sunday when my guest will be Lita McCullough-Seletsky. We'll be talking about her book, The Kneeling Man, My Father's Life as a Black Spy Who Witnessed the Assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. I've read the book, and I think you're going to enjoy meeting her. You're always welcome at the 11 o'clock Choral Eucharist upstairs at the Cathedral. We rely on your support for the forum. Gifts of any size make a difference. There are many ways to give, including texting the word WONDER, WONDER, to 76278, 76278. And Lee, thank you so much for your poetry. Thanks for your service to the state of California as our poet laureate, and thank you for being here today. We wish you all the best as you continue to do this work.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor.
Sure thing. Yeah. All right.